Iets dichterbij? Yeah? Okay. If everyone can take a seat, please. Well, welcome again, third day. I hope everyone feels fine. The word intense, it is intense. It is a festival. Really nice. Welcome again in the third day. Welcome Urgency Intensive. Welcome to Julien, Ekaterina, Lisette, and Detlef van Vuuren. I'm super happy that you're here. Also very happy to, that we have initiated this collaboration. It's a while ago, I think 5 months, where Detlef and where Julien and Ekaterina set out to work together with Lisette van Beek on a project in relation to your PhD, which we will talk about that later more. And very nice to have Detlef here. So I'm going to give the word to you, and you're going to finish it up, right?
Thanks, Hisham. Hisham, the director of Jan van Eyck Academie. And I'm Bruno. I work here as a curator. And welcome to the Intergovernmental Panel on Art and Climate Change, Working Group 4. I always struggle to get my breath out of that title. So I'm very happy to introduce the first lecture of this afternoon, When Objectivity Backfires, which is based on the publication Era de Ouro, Hora de Ouro, and analyzing current debates on environmental politics between the Brazilian government and the scientific community. This lecture sheds light on the effects of the negationist rhetoric against satellite imagery and deforestation alerts in the Amazon rainforest. Our speaker couldn't be here physically, but I'm very happy that he will join us online, so please welcome him. Thank you.
Hello, Bruno. Hi. Can you hear me now? Great. Hello, everyone. Thanks for coming. Everybody online as well. Thanks for the invitation, Bruno. Thanks for having me today. Unfortunately, I couldn't be there with you, but I will keep following today's program online. Let me share my screen now. Does anyone know how to turn on the the subtitles? Here we go. Okay. In the beginning, Tupã lived in the void of the original night. First, he created his home in the skies and stars. Underneath, he created the water and the seas. Tupã came down as a storm, and in the moment his body touched the water, the sun appeared for the first time in the skies. With the heat, Tupã's skin started to crack open and peel off. As the skin started to fall over the seas, the lands were created. This is a fragment of an origin myth from the Guarani people in Brazil. In the Tupi-Guarani mythology, Tupã is known as the spirit of the thunder. The following images are available online at the platform Terra Brasilis, built by the Brazilian National Institute for Space Research. The satellite monitoring program detects changes in the forest coverage in real time, issuing alerts to federal authorities about potential environmental crimes and areas in process of degradation due to logging, mining, or fires. Based on these images, the Environmental Inspection Agency can act locally with preservation measures. The areas in black show the alerts of deforestation spots issued from 2019 up until today in the Amazon. If we take this image and overlay with the map of indigenous reserves and territories, it becomes clear how these lands and indigenous communities are key to the preservation of the Amazon. The areas in red mainly show criminal fires, which are provoked in order to clear areas for implementing cattle farming. The livestock activity is a mean used by invaders to prove ownership over productive land, which can grant them the right over these stolen territories. The very notion of productivity and the view of nature as resource is at the core of a current environmental politics in the Amazon. Indigenous territories are perceived by Brazilian state as wasted lands. Not only that, since 2019, federal authorities have actively worked to weaken all legal and institutional structures that used to guarantee indigenous rights. This is the territory Mãe Maria in the state of Pará. Massive fires have been documented by the local community, and these images were posted on social media 3 weeks ago.
Pra cima, filma pra cima. Não, pra cima. Pra cima mais aí, ó.
By facilitating the access to guns and promoting the official propaganda against indigenous peoples, Brazilian government is not only allowing criminal fires.
Estão ameaçando a gente. Ninguém tem medo de arma aqui não. Ninguém tem medo de arma aqui não.
Today, invaders and militia groups feel authorized by the state to invade, threaten, and kill. In theory, these red areas on the map could be useful to federal authorities to stop conflicts and avoid environmental crimes. But instead of preventing the flames from spreading, the government has been busy with questioning the data and attacking the credibility of its own satellite monitoring infrastructure. In 2019, first year of Brazilian President Jair Bolsonaro's mandate, one case regarding environmental measures was heavily covered by Brazilian media. The director of the Brazilian National Institute for Space Research, Ricardo Galvão, was fired after accusations by the president that the satellite data showing the increase of deforestation in the Amazon had been falsified with the aim of harming him politically. A debate was staged and broadcast by one of the largest news channels in Brazil. The scientist Ricardo Galvão was put face to face with Ricardo Salles, then Minister of Environment of Jair Bolsonaro. The third actor was Marcelo Brito, president of the Brazilian Agribusiness Association. The configuration of speakers at the table is far from being neutral. You have representations of the scientific principles, of the cynical denial, of the free market, and of the democratic mediation, while no member of the indigenous communities, the ones affected the most by deforestation, were present. Throughout 45 minutes of debate, Galvão witnessed the integrity of his position as a scientist being questioned over and over. His discomfort was visible. But where does his discomfort comes from? It reminded me of a character that lived a very similar situation, yet in another stage.
Maintenant je suis Gaïa, et toi aussi, connard!
During the theater play Gaia Global Circus, a collaboration between Bruno Latour and a French theater group, one of the characters, Virginie, is a climatologist. In one of the scenes, she finds herself also in a very uncomfortable discussion with Ted, a climate skeptic. The discomfort felt by both Galvão and Virginie comes from the same difficulty of sustaining their position without undermining the foundations of their own field of knowledge. For centuries, the scientific method was built as the ultimate expression of notions like objectivity, impartiality, and universality. Notions that, through the historical affiliation of science with colonial enterprises, proved to be convenient idealizations for Europeans. Even so, we can say that the perspective of Western modern scientists is historically based on the search for neutrality. And the origins of modern science coincides with the origins of colonialism. Both help to shape the illusion of a non-situated and therefore universal point of view, the illusion of a perspective that conceals the subjective body and places itself beyond any perspective. In the name of universality, bearers of reason made themselves spokesperson for all peoples. Through science and colonialism, the authority of the Western gaze was built on the ideal model of an invisible man. This is a still shot from the film The Invisible Man from 1933. It is an adaptation of the late 19th century sci-fi novel by H.G. Wells. The book tells the story of a scientist obsessed with the idea of becoming invisible. Like similar horror stories from the period, the rational man gets lost in the promises of his own rationality and ends up carried away by the power of his invisibility. An invisible man can rule the world. Nobody will see him come, nobody will see him go. Don't worry, the whole world is my hiding place. As you can see in this shot, the clothes and the bandage of the character are filmic devices used to reveal the invisible body. So for instance, in this scene, someone enters the room while the invisible man is having dinner. He is caught off guard and tries to hide his invisibility with a napkin. A couple of years ago, a new Hollywood version came out. In the new adaptation, it is precisely the clothing that makes the scientist invisible. Specialized in optics, the scientist developed a new camouflage technology. After faking his suicide, he starts using his invention, an invisibility suit, in order to keep an abusive relationship with his wife, Cecilia. In the scene, Cecilia manages to reveal the presence of the invisible body for the first time. After taking the scientist to the attic, she pours a bucket of paint over him, revealing fragments of a white body. Again and again, the color white is used to give body to the invisible character. In the book Towards a Global Idea of Race, Professor Denise Ferreira da Silva highlights how science and history were used as the two main weapons for the construction of the modern subject, while deliberately ignoring racial aspects. We can say science and history were developed through a modern practice of concealment of bodies, while white ones disappeared through a self-identification with universality. Indigenous and black ones were frequently concealed under the ground. The same project allowed the first to conceal oneself in reality, and the later to be concealed from reality. So the deadlock faced by Galvão and Virginie has to do with preserving the distance and impartial authority of a scientist figure traditionally built according to the model of invisible men and women. In the following clip, we can see the frequent disclaimer Galvão used during the debate to prove his impartiality.
Primeiro, para não dar a impressão que eu estou fazendo discurso político, primeiro eu quero dizer que aí não há uma questão primeiro política, porque a primeira pessoa que criticou os dados do INPE foi o presidente Sarney, e depois, em 2008, o Blair e o Maggi, inclusive com Lula, criticaram os dados do INPE. Então, não tem questão ideológica aqui.
With a growing frustration, mostly due to the configuration of speakers at the table, Galvão became more and more isolated in his attempt to show the credibility of scientific studies.
Os estudos são enormes. O que nós temos, o Marcelo está falando de coisas publicadas na imprensa, o que nós usamos é publicação científica, ministro. Eu, quando fui ver o que eles falam, fui ver trabalho científico. Não balela, como vocês usam. Não coisa de jornalzinho, de Twitter. Admiro, desculpe, Marcelo, que use Twitter. Eu não uso Twitter.
After stating he doesn't use Twitter, the journalist makes an unfortunate comment.
O que eu quero ver
Mas fica difícil trabalhar sem usar Twitter. Eu falo por mim.
Não, quando...
Galvão fell into the stereotypical character of an alienated scientist, obsessed with his numbers and completely out of touch with the world. Cornered, As his last resort, he claimed the universality of scientific discourse.
Fala em ciência.
Eu entendo o que você está falando, Galvão, eu entendo.
Uma coisa que um dirigente, qualquer dirigente de um país tem que entender, que quando se trata de questões científicas, não existe autoridade acima da soberania da ciência. Não existe autoridade.
That was it. Galvão took the bait. What we see now is the backlash that comes from that.
Nem militar, nem política, nem religiosa.
O problema é quando a ciência está disfarçada, a ideologia está disfarçada dentro da ciência.
As the old saying goes, a broken watch is right 2 times a day. In a twisted way, Salles exposes the invisible man.
Isso não existe para nós.
Claro que existe.
Claro que não.
A própria sua fala mostrou isso.
Não.
O que nós vimos há muito tempo é a ciência se arrogando o direito de dizer isso, aquilo, administrados na parte ambiental por aqueles que também se arvoram de conhecedores absolutos do ambientalismo.
He describes scientists as absolute connoisseurs of environmentalism, then accuses Galvão of taking a political side.
Então, raciocínio, há um grau de aparelhamento dessas instituições.
Não existe, ministro.
Total. A sua postura com o presidente mostrou isso. Não.
I'm criticizing your reasoning. There is a huge political bias. Your attitude towards the president demonstrates that.
Agora, você me desculpa. O presidente da República, ministro, chamou os dados do INPE de mentirosos. Então, o senhor me escuta até o final.
Os dados foram mesmo.
Não.
Os números estavam
errados. O senhor está falando...
Nós mostramos isso semana
passada.
Ministro, o senhor me escuta.
Só uma observação. No começo do programa, o senhor disse aqui que o senhor não estava questionando os números, o senhor estava questionando a forma de divulgação.
Here, the journalist redeems herself, exposing the opportunist contradiction of Salles.
Deixa eu discutir pessoalmente porque ele veio e foi a razão, eu quero dizer claramente a razão que eu fui tão rígido com o presidente.
Não, rígido não, desrespeitoso.
Desrespeitoso, de jeito nenhum. Desrespeitoso foi o presidente da República com a ciência brasileira. Vamos colocar num tempo. O que ele falou? Ele falou, categoricamente os dados do INPE são mentirosos. O que ele está acusando? Está acusando todos os cientistas do INPE, inclusive o Carlos Nobre, inclusive todos, o Antônio Divino Moura, todos eles, de terem cometido crime de falsidade ideológica.
Não disse nada disso. Essa é a sua interpretação.
Se ele disse que é mentiroso...
Então, junto com o senhor, nessa história toda de que o governo não respeita o cientista. O presidente é uma autoridade política. E como autoridade política, ele tem uma determinada
Mas não é
visão.
Autoridade moral para falar isso.
Não tem autoridade moral. Ele é presidente da República, é a autoridade política.
Não é moral.
O senhor que coloca os cientistas acima dos cidadãos...
Here, Salles nods to the audience and explores the common sense of scientific arrogance. By extrapolating the notion of absolute knowledge from Galvão's words, scientific discourse as a whole is reduced to a mere inflated opinion by arrogant individuals.
Tinha que ser o primeiro a ter tido, era o primeiro a ter que ter tido autocontrole e postura.
And here, the lack of politeness that is expected from a distant scientific position is used against Galvão. While climate studies point to the need for coordinated action between governments to regulate the impacts of industry, neoliberalism pulls to the other direction, pushing less intervention from states, promoting free market, individualism, and national sovereignties. Here's the main concern of the market in relation to the Amazon forest.
O mais importante é que, entre percepção e realidade, o que ganha no mundo hoje é a percepção. Então, independente de todos os debates que a gente tenha que travar aqui dentro, até para rearranjar o modelo de desenvolvimento, e nisso o ministro ele está correto porque ele está rearranjando a casa, a maioria dos órgãos estavam muito bagunçados, mas a gente precisa fazer isso quieto, dentro de casa. Mudar a nossa governança dentro de casa, porque a percepção que a gente passa volta contra a gente. Esse tipo de debate, que não leva absolutamente a lugar nenhum, mas leva a uma reverberação internacional extremamente negativa. Apesar de você não acompanhar o Twitter, mais ou menos uns 500 milhões de pessoas acompanham no mundo. Então a gente precisa estar linkado.
The unease felt by Galvão is justified by the fear of seeing his research being framed as ideology, or even worse, as just another lobby. Galvão finds himself stuck between a rock and a hard place. If Galvão would take the deforestation data to its logical conclusion, he would be inevitably entering the political and economical realms, which in turn could raise questions about the foundational objectivity of his scientific vocation. But if he doesn't, his only option is to hold on to an idealized and problematic form of universalism. On the other hand, the character of Virginie opens a third alternative option to this scenario. While confronted with the exact same trap, she decides to take the opposite path of Galvão, and in a flash of fury, she assumes her political position and declares war against science deniers.
Maintenant, je suis Gaïa! Et toi aussi, connard!
Confessing the earthly limits of scientific discourse wouldn't make it less objective. On the contrary, it would make it even more credible, as it would once and for all break with the idealization of an impossible impartiality. 3 years after the television debate, the situation of the politics of denial in Brazil reached another level. The systematic budget cuts suffered by the Brazilian National Institute for Space Research made it impossible to pay the electricity bill. As a consequence, the supercomputer Tupã had to be shut down. Responsible for the weather and climate forecast in the country, Tupã was also used for climate simulations of coming decades, shared with the IPCC team for the production of climate reports. Since 2021, a less powerful replacement computer is active, but it's no longer capable of making long-term projections. After 3 years of public exposure, Galvão has followed Virginie's steps.
Hoje eu estou aqui com a Mariana Amor, essa querida companheira, cofundadora do movimento Cientistas Engajados. As reservas indígenas são fundamentais para a preservação da floresta amazônica. Para isso vai ser necessário políticas públicas muito bem articuladas pelo governo, atraindo inclusive a iniciativa privada. Eu tenho visto nas redes sociais uma reação muito positiva sobre o meu bigode. Eu no começo até estranhei, né?
On his social media, he wrote, "You can't refuse a good fight, so I decided to enter politics." Today, Ricardo Galvão has 29,000 followers on Twitter. Thank you very much.
Hi. Thank you very much. Yeah, it's a shame he couldn't be here today with us, but I hope he can follow online. We do have one of his collaborators, a current Jan van Eyck participant, Daniel Frota de Abreu, who also deserves a round of applause, please. So, our next panel is titled The Art of Modeling and Modeling Through Art, a Visual Dialogue. And it's a conversation between Detlef van Vuuren, Lisette van Beek, Julien Thomas, and Ekaterina Volkova, who I invite to sit over here while I read your bios. So, Lisette van Beek is a PhD candidate at the Urban Future Studios at the Copernicus Institute of Sustainable Development, Utrecht University. Her research is part of the Climaginary projects, which focuses on finding new ways to imagine climate futures. This involves, for instance, a 6-month art and science collaboration that Hisham referred to in the beginning with Ekaterina Volkova and Julien Thomas, supported by the Jan van Eyck Academie, which focus on building an artistic intervention for the climate modeling community. So Julien is an artist and social designer who explores the threshold between the spoken and the unspoken. He develops performative installations and processes in which the dynamics of objects in space are jointly explored and discerned through movement, rhythm, sound, and voice. Ekaterina is an artist and interactive media designer exploring critical making as a response to large-scale political issues. And last but not least, Detlef van Vuuren is a professor of integrated assessment of global environmental change at the Utrecht University and a senior researcher at the PBL Netherlands Environmental Assessment Agency. He has been strongly involved with the work of the IPCC. He was a lead author of IPCC's 4th, 5th, and 6th assessment reports and has coordinated the development of the scenarios used by the IPCC, among many other things. So the floor is yours. Thank you.
So thank you so much for all being here, physically or online. I'm super happy to be here to present something about our 6-month collaboration between Katja, Julien, and Detlef we've been doing, and which was also supported by the Jan van Eyck around imagining low carbon futures. So my PhD thesis is about the use of modeling to imagine low carbon futures. So I'm basically kind of studying what Detlef is doing, what his scenarios are doing in the world, and how we can find other ways of imagining futures. Being really excited to also work with Katja and Julien, who you already introduced. So thanks so much. I think my slide is not yet here. Oh, yeah. Thanks so much. So what are we all talking about? So we all know that the climate is changing. It's also one of the reasons we have this conference, I believe. There's a desperate need to transform to a low carbon future. This is really a tricky thing. Carbon is ingrained in almost anything we do. Some things we should maybe do a bit less of, but. So how do we actually get to this lower carbon future? So there are different ways of exploring what it might look like. But one of the primary approaches to understand the world's climate past, present, and future, we know actually through computer models. So it was the first global modeling efforts that were underlying the Limits to Growth report that was published 50 years ago. And those climate simulations looked at interactions between humanity and the Earth system, looking at how infinite growth would eventually end up in collapse, which already really steered a global environmental movement. And now the computer models, such as those that Detlef is working with, are also used to look at what happens if we do nothing, but mostly also how we get to the Paris Agreement goals. So there are different ways of reaching those goals. So different pathways. These are explored with the global models. So these model simulations have been really critical in actually setting the Paris goals. And also recently the net zero by 2050 goal, for instance, came directly actually from model calculations about how we get to 1.5 degrees. We actually need to be at net zero emissions by 2050. So what does this actually mean to go to these climate goals, and how do we develop these scenarios? I would like to Detlef to explain a little bit more.
Okay, thank you. And you can move to the next slide. Yeah, so if we want to understand climate change and how to act against it, we have to understand this full chain of this causal chain of climate change, from the energy we use, the land we use, to the emissions that are associated with these activities, to the greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere, the climate change that is a consequence of that, and the impacts. And you can, not only that, but we need to know it on different scales. For instance, the local scale where weather is experienced is related to the global scale where climate is happening. But also the choices of the European Union, maybe to import bioenergy, has consequences for land use in South America. We also have to understand time. A coal plant that we built is going to be there for 40 years. But the CO2 molecule we put in the atmosphere is going to be there for hundreds of years. And so we have to... Then we have also the relationships between climate change and other issues, biodiversity, for instance. And so at some point this becomes a little bit too complex to put this all and understand this all in my head. And so that's why we use computer models to understand this problem. Yes, and you can go on further. Yeah, so the purpose of these computer models is clearly not to predict the future, because there's no way that these computer models understand the next election outcome in the United States, which could change the future completely. But they can help us to explore different pathways and to understand the consequences of certain choices. And so that's what they try to do. And one of those models are the models that are run by the real climate scientists, the meteorologists, and they mostly look into the relationship between emissions. Can you go up a few slides? Yeah. Yes. So they mostly look into the relationship between emissions and climate change itself. And these are very, very complex models. But you can actually summarize their results quite nicely in one single graph, where you put the amount of CO2 that you put in the atmosphere on one axis and the global mean temperature on the other axis. And what you see is that there is a linear relationship. And we also have different models. Some are a little bit more sensitive, some are a little bit less sensitive. That is that uncertainty range. And so we know this relationship quite well, and we also know the uncertainty. Can you go on? So the story is quite clear. Can you go further? Yes. And so we have also another set of models which are making projections about what will happen in the future in terms of emissions. So this is the historical emissions, and you can see that emissions have been going up. And one projection you could make, let's assume that it just continues to grow in the same way that it is historically. We do it slightly more advanced than that, and so we have also models. We can put in all the policies that we have seen so far being implemented in the world, some expectations of population growth, economic development, and that results actually in that red line. And you can see that there's a difference, which is the impact of climate policies currently being implemented. You can also see that there is uncertainty, but if we take the amount of CO2 that is put into the atmosphere according to this projection, and we put it into that other graph, we can also estimate how much temperature change will happen, which is 2.5 to 3.2 degrees of temperature increase, which is also the conclusion of the IPCC report. Yeah, that's way much more than we had promised to do, to stay well below 2 and 1.5, or preferably 1.5 degree. And so this is not what we want to get, because it would lead to severe climate impacts. So we can use exactly that same graph also to calculate how much CO2 are we allowed to put into the atmosphere. So again, if you click one more. Yeah, so if you look at well below 2 point, or at 1.5, you can see that about 1,000 gigatons of CO2 can still go into the atmosphere for well below 2, and about 400 gigatons of CO2 for 1.5 degrees. Now, just to put that into perspective, at the moment we are emitting every year 42 gigatons of CO2. And so that 400 gigatons of CO2, that means that within 10 years of current emissions, we have completely used up the available space still to stay below 1.5. Or, if you click, if you go from now directly to 0, you have about 18 years to reach net zero and still stay below 1.5 degrees, and about 45 years if you want to do that for well below 2. Now, we can also use computer models to look at this a bit more. There are some options to take CO2 out of the atmosphere, for instance by reforestation, or some other options, and that's the reason why these models, if you click, get these trajectories. So the green one is for 1.5, and the purple one is for well below 2, and that means that we have to reach net zero emissions around 2050 to stay below 1.5 degree. And this is a famous number from the IPCC report, and you can easily understand why that is created. Yeah, you can go a bit further. Yeah, so we can use these models as well to ask ourselves, is it still possible to reach zero emissions in 2050? Can we design pathways that are consistent with that? And, yep. Yeah, and so then you're actually running the models in reverse. You somehow you have 400 gigatons of CO2 and you have to stay below that. And then the model can, for instance, introduce lifestyle change as an option, eating less meat, efficiency improvement, insulating your houses. It can look into renewable energy as an alternative for emitting CO2. And we can also take some CO2 out of the atmosphere. And then the model is simply asked to try and find a solution. Yeah. So it has all these options available, and it's somehow like a puzzle, needs to find different pathways that are available for reaching these goals. Yep. Yeah, you can continue. Yeah, so you get something like this, where we have our expectations for emissions in a current policy scenario, but then if you click again, we have, now I'm only looking at 2050 and 2100, and click again. So we have then pathways that are consistent with 1.5. And the important story is there are simply pathways that are consistent with staying below 1.5 degrees. We can design futures that do that. For instance, by futures that have a lot of carbon capture and storage. And for instance, we get some CO2 out of the atmosphere. But it is also possible with a lot of renewable energy. And we can also design scenarios that, for instance, have a lot of low demand and also diet change. Actually, just to look at that last scenario a little bit, the gray part that you see, that are non-CO2 emissions. That's methane emissions. They are strongly related with meat production. It's almost impossible at the moment to find technology options that bring that down. Yeah, so if we don't change our diet, we need a lot of negative emissions partly to compensate for some of that methane emissions. If we do change the diet, that's not necessary. And that's also why you don't see that very strong negative bar for that demand change scenario. Creating negative emissions, among others, might mean bioenergy and CCS. And so we can use these models to look in possible pathways and determine whether we like these pathways or not. Because bioenergy might mean land use, might also mean deforestation, for instance. And so that's where these models are powerful, just to explore different futures. Please go ahead, continue. Yeah, and then, so exactly, we have to determine which of these futures do we like, which don't we like. Yes, last slide. And so the strength of these models is the integration of techno-economic knowledge. They are very strong in describing things about economics, about technology, but they are not so strong to bring in social sciences, interest of people. And that's not very easily equated into equations, sorry. Then, so they are also very strong in exploring different futures, but they have weaknesses. Among others, they are created by experts. And experts have also a certain bias about the futures they like and they don't like. Secondly, they also assume a specific form of communication. As you could see, I was communicating a lot with graphs, which is attractive for some communities, but totally unattractive potentially for other communities. And that means that we shouldn't leave this up to the scientists alone. We need help. And you can click again. We need help in exploring different futures, to tell us which futures should we be looking at, and which futures do we find attractive. We also need help in communicating differently, and also reaching out to other communities. That's what I wanted to share.
Thank you, Detlef. So, yeah, just to clarify a little bit more. So the global modeled pathways look at cost-efficient pathways. So we are also wondering, how could we also think about other societal considerations? Should we just care about cost efficiency, or maybe also more about climate justice or sufficiency? Can we still assume that for eternal economic growth, or should we imagine different kind of future? Should we see, just like we just saw before our talk, should we talk about seeing nature as a resource, or maybe think about rewilding? So, and also, as Detlef said, is communicating science enough to just accelerate this transformation? They had now 6 assessment report since 1990. And actually in the same period of time, the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere has only been rising. So this was kind of the starting point for us to also look at what are other ways actually we could imagine different futures. And we were looking at the artistic practices especially. So we, when I say we, that the three of us for the past 6 months were working together to have a closer look at the global modeling group. So we were kind of bothering Detlef's modeling team with all kinds of annoying and sometimes naive questions. We understood better how they make scenarios, which kind of assumptions did they make, and how we could actually help them also to think about which kind of futures they could explore differently or communicate differently. So over the past 6 months, we've been working together and also with Detlef. So I was wondering, Detlef, if you could just share a reflection of the past 6 months working with Katja and Julien.
Yeah. And so originally, when we started your project, I thought that it would be mostly about communication, about how to better communicate some of the findings that we have in our work. In reality, we have been actually much more working also on that question of how do modelers work and what do they assume in their work. I must say that so we had a lot of discussions about that in a similar way maybe as the movie that was just before our presentation. For us, having that objectivity is anyway quite important, but for my IPCC report work, it's absolutely important because we need our results need to be relevant for Saudi Arabia, for Europe, for Barbados, and so trying at this one hand to do objective science, but also being confronted with the limits of objectivity and some of the choices we made. I think that is some interesting discussion we had, and trying to find also the blind spots in some of the work that you do is helpful for me. I think it's also helpful for some of the team members. So I thought it was quite fascinating.
Right, thanks so much. So we were working on this research together, and actually Julien and Katja are also working on an artistic intervention, which we will bring in at the end of our talk. So we would like to share some of our thoughts around this art-science collaboration through a visual dialogue. And you might wonder what it is. Well, the only way is to just start, I think. So I'll give the floor to Detlef.
Yes, you can go to the next. So this is actually a famous graph among us as scientists, as climate scientists, because this is actually how we see our work. We are cartographers, we're map makers. We don't determine where we need to go. That's what the politics does. And so we can choose different goals like 1.5 degree or well below 2 degree. And we can try to map out different routes to get there and show what are the possible things we will encounter on this way, and whether we find them attractive or not so attractive. And that's our metaphor for the work that we are doing, which is a very attractive metaphor for us. But you could start to question whether that absolutely works, but up to you guys.
So I'm thinking back to Bio's keynote 2 days ago, where he talks about the need to get lost in order to orient oneself to different flows that are maybe below the surface. And it's also been a bit of a mantra for us in this residency, this statement, no reorientation without disorientation. And we think that the role of metaphors is helpful in guiding us in certain paths or not. And this kind of route map metaphor that the climate scientists have been using, it presupposes certain things. For example, that we have the knowledge of where to go, and also that we have the information to make the right decisions. And you think, okay, so we have all the technology, We have the financial measures. All we need is the political will. But political will is actually quite fickle, and it relies on trends and pop culture and cultural norms and historical trajectories. And so it's actually not that clear oftentimes. And so if you look back in the history of cartography, we're actually maybe in a different way of looking at it is from the role of an ancient cartographer, where our roots were not known so much, and certain terms were created in order to acknowledge that unknown capacity. So, for example, terra incognita, unknown land, or drawing serpents or dragons or foreign beasts to signify things that we don't understand, that lie beyond. But also, I think, hold on, notes. Yep, there we go. You could also take the idea of a route map and turn it around as a kind of footpath. And the writer Robert McFarlane creates this, elaborates this further by talking about how maps are actually, footpaths are made by countless feet walking and making a path. And so he has a quote that says, "Paths are habits of a landscape. They are acts of consensual making. It's hard to create a footpath on your own. Like sea channels that require regular dredging, paths need walking." So this idea that a path is forged through the act of walking encourages us to reflect on the role of a cartographer and the tools they have at hand to walk through this more societal landscape. And in our discussions with the modelers, we came up with a different metaphor altogether, which is that of a diet. Dietitians and fitness experts are very good at explaining to you what energy you need to consume or not, and how to burn calories more efficiently. And seen in this metaphorical standpoint, you could see that geoengineering, such as carbon capture and sequestration, would be more like liposuction, or certain fashion choices that hide the problem or kind of avoid the root of the problem altogether.
Thank you, Julien. So can I invite Detlef to respond to this idea of terra incognita and also the idea of the diet as a new metaphor?
Yeah, yes. So terra incognita is something what we're playing with a lot anyway, because we need to make in these model calculations somehow with assumptions about future technologies, and we try to be somewhat conservative, and that's simply because we don't want to we don't want to err on the side of showing easy solutions if they would not be available. And so trying to, I think generally we at the very least we have to make assumptions of technologies that are available in 2050, and we know that they will be quite different, and also lifestyle changes, by the way, in 2050 and anything, and so yes, this notion of that unknown area is quite important. The second point on the is that I think in this whole discussion we also have been discussing a lot on what right does the map maker have to draw certain routes and not other routes, and I think that is also a quite important discussion in this. And the last point on the diets, yeah, I think the main difference would also be that it is somewhat also related to the debate on objectivity versus subjectivity, because objective, just drawing maps, that comes to that role that we would like to have as this objective scientist. The dietist obviously has a certain direction. It's quite clear in which direction you would like to move and where you want to help and not help.
Right, thank you. So we go to the next one. Detlef?
Oh yeah, that's the one on stories. And so it's quite clear that not everything can be modeled. And so that's why in making our scenarios, we first have this exercise of storytelling. And so we sit down with people and try to think of different possible futures. And so actually for the last set of IPCC scenarios, we did this with 60 people at some place where we were thinking about relevant developments of this world. And so in this case, we developed these 5 different stories of the world, possibly a green growth scenario, but also possible a scenario where inequality continues to play a major role, or regional rivalry. And we tried then to translate these into short stories about how these stories look like, and then use the models to start painting how these futures might look like in more detail. And so if we would take, for instance, that green growth scenario, if global cooperation is part of that storyline, there might be a lot of sharing of technology. So technology advancement might be relatively fast. And that's something that relates to what I have in the model, because I have to make assumptions about technology change. I also have to make assumptions about population growth. And so in that green growth scenario, I would say make relatively low assumptions on population growth. So I can use these stories to make consistent sets of assumptions into the modeling work. So stories are really important for us. We actually paint quite detailed stories when we are among the modelers. When we have to communicate to the policy process, all of a sudden we have to be a little bit less detailed, because some of these words have a very strong meaning in negotiations. And so most of the time these scenarios are now referred as SSP3 or SSP1. And you can see that on the left. And on the left, that's what came out of the models. And you see the scenarios being summarized simply by their small name and the emission trajectory that could be associated with them. And so we have this interesting thing with storytelling and modeling.
So stories as different sets of assumptions that lead to different outcomes and emissions, right? Yeah.
That's our definition of a story.
So every story has a narrator. Even if you read an IPCC report where it's all about consensus and objectivity and couching things in this language with these terms about we are pretty much sure on this. This is factual. It's written from the point of view of third-person objective, which kind of masks a certain position. We would say that even a graph also speaks or presents itself from a certain point of view, but we're not really sure which point of view it is. It's quite abstract. And so what we wanted to do is look into this storyline theme. And in our research, we came across Kurt Vonnegut's shapes of stories. So he would say that most stories in Western civilization follow a similar set of storylines. And you could say that in every single SSP storyline trajectory, there are billions of subjective stories kind of woven through that line. And whereas whereas a IPCC report, SSP1 has temperature or concentrations of carbon on the y-axis, Kurt Vonnegut would say that it's good and ill fortune. And so we're going to look a little closer into SSP1, and we're going to share 3 stories with you. The first is a Kafkaesque story of going from bad fortune to worse. And so according to SSP1, where we save the world and we meet our emissions targets, I think it's every sea turtle population will go extinct. So it's kind of a short story, but there's not much character development. That's what I'm trying to say. And so we could go on to the next story, which is a Cinderella story, and it's about an oil executive, and his profits keep growing, his fortune keeps growing over the years, until there's a shift in the economy and renewables take over, and his profits plummet. But luckily, he's been investing in renewables for a long time, and he's not an oil company anymore. He's an energy company. And so, by the end of the story, his fortune has gone up again. SSP1 from another point of view. And then the last story we want to share is the story of Lars. He's a Swedish biodynamic winemaker. And he loves wine so much, he's moved to Portugal. and he's doing everything he can to have a low impact on the planet in the way he's growing his grapes. But after years of drought, the wine industry in Portugal has collapsed, and so he packs up everything. But luckily he's Swedish, and so he can go back to Sweden, where the wine climate is great. So the story ends well for him as well.
Thanks for sharing. Do you want to respond, Detlef?
Yeah, so clearly this debate is also about, first of all, scale. We tend to focus pretty much on the very aggregated global scale in our storytelling and our scenario work, while obviously also people live in that world, and there is the subjectivity, and that doesn't show up so much in the work that we have, but in some of the form of communication, finding that subjectivity might be more interesting than in the way that we communicate in this aggregated scale. And I think, yeah, those two stories can really help each other. The work on the aggregated scale that we do, but also others that might find more subjective ways of telling that story.
Yeah, thank you. So I was wondering, can it also be the other way around? Because talk about like the global stories could be communicated differently, but could it also be that personal stories could inspire different global storylines?
I think so, yes. And I think, yeah, so the work that we were doing with Katja and Julien working with the team might also have some of the team members thinking of maybe picking that up, and yeah, so yes, sure.
Cool. Thanks so much. You can keep talking.
Yeah. So the last theme that we wanted to pick up was the theme of time, and so time is a crucial part of the work that we're doing. And with the models, partly we go out really long, very far into the future, and that's because some of these processes, these Earth processes, are very slow. With some of the decisions that we're now making in fossil fuel use, we will be determining for centuries what will be happening. And especially sea level rise is a process that is so slow, and that if you want to see the real impacts of sea level rise, also for this country, you might need to look at 2200, because of some of the processes that have been started now simply involve make it himself apparent only in that in 2 centuries. And so these models try to connect that very long term and the consequences of our decisions today for very long term. And so that's also what you see here. We have it as current policy scenario again. We have the 2 degree and the 1.5 degree scenario. And so we focus often on 2050 as something that is at least still thinkable. But again, we can relate that to the very long term, but you also need to relate it to actually decisions that are needed to make today. And somehow the scenarios try to do that, but maybe you would like to say more on this.
So we had a conversation with the modelers, and we asked why the models usually stop at 2100, even though the effects last even longer. But we were also wondering why they didn't go shorter. It seems like 2100 is kind of a middle ground conclusion. And so, okay, I'll keep going. And so we were talking about this with the modelers, and how like a political term lasts 3 to 4 years, a policy horizon lasts 10 years, yet we're looking at models up to 2100. And how can we kind of bridge these differences of the urgency and the kind of political practicalities of civil servants and elected officials? And we also were reminded that a real story, according to a storyteller, is an elaboration over time, not just a setting at one point. And so we thought, well, there's actually data that can kind of go across every 5 or 10 years. We could tell a story that elaborates by taking these snapshots. And so we were kind of inspired by, well, the history of film, which is basically a series of static images stitched together to create something that moves. And so one of our proposals for the modelers was to kind of take a more segmented understanding so that people can start imagining what it looks like. I mean, we talk about this decade as a decade of action. And what does this model tell us about what's going to happen in the next 10 years, 15 years, or 2050? I think that's it.
Right, you want to respond?
Yeah, so I 100% agree that trying to bring things back to the next 10 years is critical. And I have tried to illustrate that as well with the 400 gigatons of CO2. If we continue as we're currently doing, 1.5 is done in 10 years. But even if that pathway that you need to be at zero in 20 or 30 years, and most of the action is going to be in the next 10 years. And so the models also need to help us guiding decisions in the next 5 years, in the next 10 years. Something that we hardly do as modelers, and that might also be a bit inspired by this dialogue. We have continuous stories. We have this storyline, and then we make these assumptions in the model, and then the model has this continuous story from now into the future. But you could also think, and that's with your movies and your steps, you could think of, okay, let's go to 2025 in your story, and then consider what people had experienced in that period, and whether the storyline at that point of time is still logically unfolding in the same way, or whether people are responding to what they're seeing, and that you can do that also in that time step idea that you were providing.
Right. So the last thing we would like to do is to share some thoughts about the kind of artistic intervention.
So over the past 6 months, we've been having over 20 conversations with modelers, and also asking questions about their work informed by different domains of more creative fields, translation, storytelling, graphic user interface, and cartography. And through all of these conversations, we decided that we wanted to offer back to the modeling community a manual on how to do modeling from an artist's point of view. So the manual will be available online in about a month. You can go to this website and you can register, and we will send you an update when it's ready for you to view. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much.
You can stay there. Thank you. Well, we have some time for Q&A. If anyone has questions, I can pass you the mic. Sophie.
Thank you all so much. That was really interesting. I wanted to ask you a question about the process of modeling, and the process of storytelling is obviously really vital. But how do you address the potential, or maybe the reality, of a desensitization of audiences from models? Because like a lot of these things, when you're showing them, that you're really shocked when you see them, and we know that there's this disjuncture between what people know and how people behave. And how do you see the role, or all of your roles, in that, trying to prevent a kind of desensitization to the shock of them, or can you? I don't know.
This is the right way, but yes, I think somehow providing options, that's what we hope to do. We hope to show that there are pathways, and that it's us, we can prevent some of those futures that are not attractive, and decide to act. I know that there is a huge risk also with some of the climate work, that actually you show dystopias and people say, okay, this is not going to happen, whatever. And so I think it's crucial to really emphasize that even if 1.5 is not going to happen, it's even much more important not to stay at 1.6 or prevent one. I personally, and that's a very important thing that I try to communicate. Indeed, that it's not the end of the world if we would miss one target. It's just a reason to even try better for the next target.
Yeah, so for me personally, my PhD thesis I addresses also that when I look at the media, for instance, there's all these, pictures of like the Amazon and as well, firing and everything, and it becomes really difficult to imagine a way out, kind of. So we need to think about, everyone talks about these big words of transformation and, everything that's needed, but what does it actually look like, and how can you also make it look like a future that it could actually be desirable? Because like mitigation debate is also always about like, oh, you cannot fly anymore, you cannot eat meat anymore. So yeah, there's this whole negative spirit around it. Yeah, I don't know if you want to add something.
I was also struck by that conversation you had with the journalist about how he reads reports and how he presents them, and I think that's also not very, maybe you could do a better job of explaining. Yeah, no, from the parole or the NRC or something, you talked to us. Volkskrant, yeah, one of them. Yeah, like, it's quite depressing how journalists read these reports, and I think that's a big problem. They don't even look into the reports themselves, and the way that they just pump it out into, that's not going to help us either. I don't know if you want to go into detail about that conversation, but
yeah, I think you summarized quite well.
They basically look at like the last report and how things have changed, and then they just go for that, and then that's it. They leave it at that. There's no curiosity around how this information could be presented differently.
They look into the press release of some of the researchers of IPCC, and then they look into the graphs, and that's it. But also they need to publish like in a few hours or something. And then if IPCC is running late and it happens because of the negotiations, then they just don't have time, and that's what we get in the media.
I think what Lisette just said about emphasizing also the positive parts of that change is also crucial. Especially here in the Netherlands, somehow we had this climate deal for 2030, which is mostly about emission reductions, but we don't have a vision on where we would like to be in 2050. And that's, for me, a bit odd. Why are we not thinking of that attractive society that we would like to achieve in 2050 and then see that 2030 as a way to go there? And I think that is something that would be quite important, I think, for the Netherlands to add to its story. The second point I would like to add is, and this is somehow also difficult in communication, but since Paris, things are changing. We have also some positive trends. And when we did the 2014 report, we would say about renewables, they're attractive. They're somewhat expensive than fossil fuels, but not so much expensive, more expensive. Now, in the 2021 report, we can say renewables are cheaper than fossil fuels. And at the moment, people are more investing in renewables than in fossil fuel. They shouldn't be investing in fossil fuels alternatives at all, but there is a change. The same for transport. In 2014, we would say that's a really difficult sector. Maybe bioenergy. Now, here at least in Europe, you would expect electric vehicles to take over, and people are investing in that. So there are things also changing somewhat for the better. That should not be interpreted as we're getting there, because a lot of still needs to happen as well. And so it's somehow trying to communicate positive sides and it not being, again, then interpreted as things are moving. It's a quite interesting balance that you have to find in that communication.
Yeah, just thank you so much. Should I give it? Oh, I'll give it to you first, and then you can give it to. Yeah. Okay, cool. Well, I mean, it's very difficult to objectify 2050, right? Even when you state 2050, it seems as an objectifying something in the future, right? I think the answer lays in the idea that you don't take account of subjectivities that the subjectivity itself is the thing that we should be looking at. These are the different pathways, let's say. You call them pathways, which for me is something, as you say, is something that you tread through, right? It's not something in the future for me or something like that. So, and if you look at 2050, I mean, we all have different ideas of what that would be, no? We have different, for instance, the Prime Minister of the Netherlands would say that I can't have a vision because that's like an elephant that takes the sight away, right? He literally said that. One of your slides, in fact, nails it down for me, and I was particularly struck by that, which says something as, it's not about the models, but it's about talking with each other. So, in fact, why would we talk with each other? That might have to do with all the differences that we have, right? And the different ways we view the world. So isn't this where we should start? And is this sort of where sort of the core of your critique lays, no?
I guess that's exactly what we're trying to do, because when we started this research, you get quite frustrated with climate models quite quickly, I would say.
No offense. No offense.
No offense, but you do. And then you know that these are brilliant people working on this thing, and they have an intention of making the world a better place or for us to survive on this planet. But getting super cynical about it is also not the way. So I guess what we're trying to do also in the manual is very similar to the topic of your video. In one of the Daniel's work that we've seen before, and one of the chapters is called somewhat "You're political," like you need to acknowledge that, and what do you do then? But I think, yeah, indeed, we need to be talking to each other, and we all need to be trying to do our best.
You're doing a good job. Yeah. No, but I felt that these are the first steps, right? And with this manual, or you're kind of providing your vision on how to model, on how to view the world in a sense, or how to make a framework of how we can sort of harness how other people might view the world, or how we can create scenarios in that sense to the modelers themselves. You know, so it's maybe your idea of what scenario is very different. I mean, exactly. It's the aggravated, and it's the very personal, and I don't know. There's something there. I felt it's pretty okay.
If I can add one more thing before we go to the other question. So the manual was actually also developed in collaboration with the modelers, because it's like also kind of sensing like what is the kind of thing that they would need or that would inspire them. So it's really a conversation. Sorry, that was the last thing.
Yeah, I was wondering, and that's maybe in the manual, and I'm really looking forward to read your manual, and thank you for your whole talk, is whether you could give an example of a positive way of communication. For example, you named how journalists don't interpret models well, or yeah. But do you have a way you would like to see it, an example, or is that in your manual? And I was wondering if you've seen the movie 2040 by Damien Gamo from Australia, and I don't think I pronounced his name right. But in his movie, it's exactly what he does is he gives us a view into the future in a very positive way while explaining the whole climate problem. So my question is actually, do you have an example of of something you find a positive way that really that you would recommend?
Do you want to respond?
I can, but what's the website that we came back to and again? Climate tracker, carbon brief is good, but it still expects you to walk towards their lingo. But so we were constantly being confronted with the assumption by the modeling team that we were there to communicate science. And we specifically walked away from that. And so the model is not necessarily about how to communicate better, but it's more like if you looked at modeling from the role of a translator is constantly trying to understand the tone of voice of the original and to convey it into the next version. What does tone of voice mean in modeling? Is it the voice of nature? How is nature's voice conveyed in data? Can you look at legal rights as giving nature a voice? What would that do to a land use model, for example? Right? So it's not like we're really going into the modeler's domain, but also using accessible language. So in a way, we're trying to be communicative, but we specifically wanted to address their minds, their practices.
Yes, thanks for a really beautiful project and presentation. Yeah, I have a million thoughts, but I'll try to keep it brief. Yeah, I'm a friend of Julien, so I heard about this project a long time ago, and then always Julien was talking about, I'm working with these climate modelers, and at some point I got like, oh, he's actually working with these people that work with integrated assessment models, and that also came across in Detlef's presentation, that actually, you know, there's of course a lot of chaos in the climate system, but what Detlef is modeling is also hugely about human behavior and the complexity of human behavior that is utterly unpredictable because it's about our own political choices. So at some point I understood that you're modeling, if you talk also about the voice of nature, we're actually talking also about our own voices, and that's definitely why we should talk together. And I really liked your critical approach in this project, and I think it's so valuable to think about the bias and the economical growth models that are part of the assessments. But what I, as a climate scientist and an artist, personally missed when I was doing a PhD in climate science is definitely the role of stories, and not only the stories of all these million subjective stories of the turtles and Lars the winemaker, but also my own story as a scientist who is sailing the oceans, who is so much feeling all these entanglements of the climate system, of the biosphere. And that's what I so much miss in the permeability between maybe being embedded within academia and what you would like to share with wider communities is what is not the graphs, not the outcomes of the models, which are indeed these scenarios that follow a story over time, but what is in the model, what is the web of entangled feedbacks of, you can call it system assemblages, however you want to call it, this sort of mysterious interconnectedness of water molecules, of solar radiation, of albedo, of ice, everything that you gain so much embodied knowledge as a scientist, and how can you share these stories? So I was wondering if Detlef has a personal story that he would like to add to this visual dialogue.
Oh dear. So I think this is, I think it's a very important question. I think it's also getting more and more important for us scientists. So obviously, 10 years ago, you were a very good scientist if you published in Nature and you had a lot of citations. I think also at universities, we are now more and more thinking of, but it's actually about impact and what does it, and so we are finding ways that we're doing things. And to take it in even more personal, so first, the first thing that is related to your question is, anyway, the risk with working with models is that you create this black box, and so somehow you also need to find ways to communicate actually what you're doing. I'm mostly doing that at the moment by trying to also simplify things. So when I was showing the Earth system models, and they are extremely complex, if you can summarize them simply with this cumulative CO2 versus temperature story and indicating a little bit some of the main things that come out of these models, sometimes you can maybe communicate better than with the whole complexity part of this. And so we have to find that also for the integrated assessment models and try to describe what we are doing, which is maybe even more complex because it's for the Earth system models you still have simply the science and the truth of science. In our case, it's also about choices, about humans indeed. So yeah, we're looking for ways to do that. Let's see whether I've. For me, it's still learning as well. So this is a learning process of trying to see what brings this to me and what I can. The same thing is this year since the IPCC report, I'm going to many places to tell the story of what is in that report, and there I'm also learning quite a bit. And so next Wednesday we go to ABP to talk with them about what does it mean for their decisions. They already made a decision to move out of fossil fuels, but apparently they still want to know more about what's in that report. So it's for me also pretty much a learning experience of how to possibly communicate better.
Yeah. Hi, thank you for the presentation. I have a question. I read a book called The Nutmeg's Curse by Amitav Ghosh a few months ago, and he says in models or reports where there's the main polluters mentioned, like it's often airline industry or industries in general, agriculture, and he says what's often missing as a separate category or a separate polluter is the military in his experience or his reading of scientific reports. Because in the US, for example, the military is the main user of crude oil, is the main buyer. And I wonder if you also feel that this should be mentioned as a separate category and why this isn't being mentioned, and especially in a world that's being increasingly militarized. I think that's a good question to ask. And also, wouldn't that also take away the focus on now it's very, you as a citizen are treated as a consumer, and your consumerist choices determine how you influence the climate. And I wonder if that would also take away or kind of mitigate the responsibilities.
Want to respond to that?
So starting with the last part. So I think indeed, but I was trying to, for instance, also emphasize that with the different response strategies, it's not only about consumers. It's also about creating the environment, the infrastructure where people can make their choices, and both in physical infrastructure, but also in terms of the laws or the society that's around them. But also, there's no way that I can determine myself how some of the goods that I consume are produced, and so I need also changes that happening on that side. So it's both on the consumer side, but also on the producer side, and I hope that we were communicating that. And on your military question, I simply don't know. I would be a bit surprised that at the moment the military would be the largest consumer of crude oil in the US, but clearly it is a major consumer, and I'm afraid indeed that you're a bit right that it's not going down, and so I have to start looking into this more. I simply don't know at this point of time.
I maybe shouldn't be throwing unverified facts into the room, but I did hear somewhere that the US military consumes as much energy as the country of Greece.
Well, at least I can really recommend the book.
As a final question, I would like just to ask Rachel Bacon, who's watching online, question for everyone. And she says, this came up yesterday as well. In relation to the use of data to influence governmental policy, What happens when the data and scientific knowledge is ignored or disbelieved by those in charge? I know this is a thorny question for everyone. I think it also relates to the first contribution. So, anyone has any thoughts?
Yeah, I think actually right before our talk, Detlef was telling this story, but maybe you have another story of how IPCC results are kind of negotiated and how you deal with it with different countries. You don't want.
Yes. So this was a story also about. Yes, some of the decisions are painful, so we have to change everywhere now, because if you want to stay within that 1.5 degrees target, it's not only anymore a change in developed countries, it's also a change in developing countries. Historically, more than 2/3 of the emissions came from the developed world, and now at the moment 2/3 of the emissions is coming from developing countries, and so the uncomfortable part of the negotiations, but therefore also of the IPCC approval, is that change needs to happen everywhere, and we have to find also fairness into that debate. And so that is actually playing quite a role in the approval session. And I was giving the example of India, which has a lot of coal use. If you look at the IPCC reports, one of the things that you would like to get rid of first is coal. And it's simply very attractive, cost-effectively to get away of coal. But yeah, would that mean that you do more action in India than in Europe? That's unthinkable. And so for us modelers, we have always answered that question by, oh, but maybe there could be payments from Europe or the US to India. That works perfectly in the model. But if that, I think a political scientist or might tell you that in the real world that is not the most logical solution, hundreds of billions. It's a fair solution, but it's maybe not a realistic solution. And so maybe there needs to be other thinking about fairness in the scenarios and how that potentially changes the story. And so I hope that was the story that you were referring to, and that's partly. But in general, yeah, for me as a scientist, if people are misusing the information, the only thing I can do is emphasizing again what the truth is, and yeah, we're doing our best in that sense. And I think that in that sense, IPCC is a very important institution, also with its limitations. But at least all countries approving the results is an important step.
Yeah, maybe just one thing to add, it's not always just like ignoring the fact, but also sometimes just kind of misinterpreting it, because there was also this Guardian article saying that we only have 10 years to save the climate when there was this 2030 goal announced by, so it's, yeah, it's also the numbers sometimes being misinterpreted.
Detlef, Lisette, Julien, Katja, thank you so much. We're going to have a 30-minute break, and you're all invited to join us upstairs at 5 to continue the conversation.
Thank you.